Greetings and welcome back, my history-loving mischief. Brian Guthrie, aka Guthron the Balding Bard, here again with you. Today we're going to dive into character creation as it relates to historians. We are going to touch on how it's different for historians, the importance of research, especially for historians, but spend most of this lesson discussing a temptation you may face when creating these individuals and writing your narrative. It's called revisionism. Up to this point, we've discussed the theory of Dramatica, its core elements, key differences with other theories of writing, and we've started on the story foundations. You've created your initial story synopsis. You began settling on the story themes. You've tackled your story central question or the argument that drives the whole story. And you've created your first versions of your elevator pitch, the logline. We're about to move into probably the most important part of any writing process, your characters. Now, this course aims to help historians write better history, in particular narrative history and historical fiction. Our approach to characters will differ in one crucial sense. You will probably be using actual figures from history. We usually have some information that helps us understand who they were publicly, how they spoke, things like that. We probably have diaries or journals. Maybe we have speeches that help us understand, at the very least, how they would speak in public. In short, we know, or at least we can know these people up to a certain point. Because of that, we have to approach the character creation side of Dramatica a little bit differently. One thing you will find as we dive deeper into the character creation part of Dramatica is that working with actual historical figures will really kind of make your job easier as you're going through the process. When we need to answer, say, a question about a character's motivation, you already know some of that because this is an actual person. You could actually say, with evidence that you can connect to, this person was motivated by this. To do all that, we have to conduct very thorough research on these people. We will dive into the research part more as we progress through the course. Before we do that, however, I want to address one particular issue that you may face as you flesh out your characters, whether they're real or just inspired by real people. As historians, we have a duty to the truth. While we can be selective about the truths we use, such as we're writing about the Civil War, we may not necessarily need to talk about European history. That's what I mean by selective truth. Some things just may not need to be mentioned because they don't pertain to the story. So when we're writing our historical monograph or our narrative history work or just historical fiction, we have to be mindful of a few issues. First, we cannot create a false image or impression by leaving certain pieces of information out. It lies through omission. Second, we cannot create truth where that truth doesn't exist. Just because we think someone was something does not mean we can write them like that unless we have proof that they were that something. Everything we do needs to be firmly based in the truth, in your evidence, in your research, in your footnotes, whatever you include in your monograph, your narrative, or your historical fiction. So before I continue on that part, let me give you an example of how you could do this correctly so you know what I'm talking about. And for that, I will dive into the original fandom, in the modern sense of the word, Star Trek. And by that I mean the people who created things like fan fiction and shipping certain relationships that weren't necessarily in the story. I'm going to assume you all know what Star Trek is, even if just in passing. If not, take a moment and acquaint yourself with it. When Star Trek originally premiered in 1966, its lead character became one of the most iconic fictional personas of the 20th century. I'm referring to James Tiberius Kirk. You know, this guy. After appearing in the new pilot of the series, Kirk quickly became the poster boy for what 1960s era men thought a 22nd century enlightened man would become. A tough captain who knew which rules to break, which rules to bend and win. He strove to be a pacifist, but he wasn't afraid to use President Theodore Roosevelt's proverbial big stick. The iconic American good guy hero character. The intentions of the show's creators and runners have often come under scrutiny, particularly in the past decade or so, but everyone agrees they were trying to make something better. And despite all of their good intentions, Kirk was still a white male authority figure who, like his creators, struggled with what it really meant to be a man, particularly with women. There are many examples of the show trying to showcase women but failing to meet their own standards, in part because of ignorance, and other parts because, the studios wouldn't let them do certain things. Kirk was no exception to this. In the first episode produced, starring Kirk as captain of the Starship Enterprise, not the first one aired, but the first one produced, entitled Where No man has gone before. We see Kirk encountering his yeoman assistant, and multiple times he can't even remember her name. And then when he goes to move her on the bridge, he actually physically moves her out of the way. He doesn't ask her if he can touch her or nothing. In the same scene, they have specialists from the ship come up onto the bridge and introduce themselves, and one of them is a female doctor who isn't allowed to introduce herself. A male introduces her. And then when another character starts to flirt with her and she doesn't respond, he derides her for not responding to his advances. And Kirk, hearing the whole thing, doesn't stop him. Now that doesn't stop him from being overtly sexist later. In the episode Requiem for Methuselah, he actually takes part in the sexual objectification of a woman guest on the ship, and he even argues Science Officer Spock about doing it, acting like the fight over a woman by males was a time-honored tradition among human males. Kirk said to Spock at one point that Vulcan was the only planet could actually claim that their women were logical. In the episode Is There in Truth No Beauty, Kirk, Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy, and Engineer Montgomery Scott spend an entire meal fawning over a visiting female, and they completely ignore her that she's a professional ambassador. All they can say about her was how beautiful she was. In the final episode of the series, Kirk emphasized this sexist nature by saying that the guest character could only have lived a richer life if she accepted a subservient or diminished role in her life as the lover of a captain, but not ever being an actual captain. For the time, this treatment of women was not only completely accepted by almost everyone, but almost nobody even saw how wrong it was, and that included many women. When I recently rewatched the original series with my wife and one of her best friends from high school, the pair of them were aghast at Kirk's treatment of women in particular and the show's treatment of them in general. Now, my wife's friend had never seen it before, but my wife had. While she was aware that it was there, she didn't realize how pervasive and how bad it was until recently. Now, let's fast forward 50 years. In 2017, Star Trek series returned to TV with the show Discovery. That show by itself rewrote how Trek starred and portrayed everyone that were not white and not male. In season 2, they introduced us to new versions of some original familiar characters, Spock for one, and the barely used Captain Pike, and Number 1, who both appeared in the unaired pilot and then later in the episode The Menagerie. Those three would actually go on to star in Star Trek's latest show, Strange New Worlds. This show, many argue, is what Trek would have always been had good intentions been allowed to happen. For one, it blows the Bechdel test out of the water, especially when compared to pre-Discovery shows, so original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, and all their related movies. If you're not familiar with the Bechdel test, make a note, research it later. We get a diverse crew that is predominantly female or non-binary, several male characters that are not threatened by the individual empowerment of others. They have nuanced discussions on issues Trek has always been great about taking on regarding topics society doesn't want to or cannot openly discuss. Season 2's second episode is one of Trek's finest episodes of all time, with a nuanced discussion of, here's the list, racism, classism, religious oppression, genocide, immigration, healthcare, and military elitism that honestly could become mandatory viewing in ethics classes, philosophy, sociology, human rights, more. That was all in just one episode. However, I digress. At the end of season 1, the showrunners introduced the new version of Kirk to the show. And to be honest, that first showing was not very promising. Kirk still felt mostly like his original form. He was still brash, willing to do controversial things, etc. It also didn't help that with the episode, because it occurred in an alternate timeline, the showrunners decided to remove most of the female characters through various plot devices. It really felt like too much like what original Trek did, but I think that was intentional by the writers, because they were trying to convince Captain Pike, they were trying to convince him not to change the future. Now, I recently just rewatched the episode with my non-binary child, pronouns she, they, and after finishing it, she was absolutely infuriated by Kirk. I felt emotionally constipated like I did watching any of the original series. We continued into season 2 the next day, and they were quite vocal about their feelings when my wife joined us. Then we got to episode 3, where we again get an alternate timeline version of Kirk. To say my child was angry is putting it mildly, as she did not want another show with constipating Kirk, emotions-wise, their words. That changed the instant we reached the story's climactic moment. She could not believe how quickly the show transformed Kirk into something new. They also could not believe how quickly they now loved the character. In the 6th episode, the actual Kirk in the prime timeline does arrive for several episodes, and he is, to again put it mildly, a transformed man. He doesn't mix up anyone's name. He doesn't physically touch women, or really anybody, without their permission. He never objectifies any female presenting characters, and he's openly encouraging to this show's version of Nyota Uhura when she's facing a dilemma that only she can fix. In fact, at one point, he he has to apologize to her, and he actually does apologize to her when he gets excited and starts trying to explain her idea. That brings up another thing that his character highlights. The entire show is void of mansplaining. To say it's a refreshing break from the toxicity of the original Kirk is, again, putting it mildly. The idea of rewriting a character, using the same character, is, as a writer, it's brilliant. It's not novel to this show. It's just interesting to watch it happen with such a well-known character. Now, how does this apply to what we're doing? That's the question in your minds, right? I just showed you how you can correctly do it, but the reason I did that is because I want you to see how it looks when you do it correctly in a non-threatening situation. When we write history, we have to be mindful of accidentally doing the same thing, even if we have good intentions. We must be mindful of what Catherine Wishallen describes as the danger of presentist views of the past, which come from conclusions that we have using modern knowledge, modern expertise, modern experiences that didn't exist back then. As one example, take John and Abigail Adams. This couple, they traded many letters during the founding era of America, and depending on your perspective or your agenda, you can read these letters that they wrote to each other in a variety of ways. Abigail's letters to John regarding women in the new nation could be interpreted as a defense of the current state, the status quo for women, or you could also interpret it as a call for more equality for women. Taken out of context that considers changing 18th century views on gender roles, masculinity in society and the home, domesticity, and many, many more, one could selectively quote these letters to support multiple positions. And in doing that, you would change the character to something that may not necessarily be 100% accurate, which we're never going to be 100% accurate. But as long as the version you present can be connected to evidence that hasn't been potentially misinterpreted, you're going to be on much firmer ground. And sometimes even taking things in context might lead to some misinterpretation of what's happening. And this is the problem that we as historians, when we're writing history, when we're writing stories about these historical figures, that we face. It's a very nuanced thing that we do writing history. We must be very mindful of the complexities of the society and the people that we're writing about, that we're studying, while being honest with what we're creating. You may want to write a fictional story occurring in an actual historical event that potentially makes things look better, but it's a what-if scenario of history, right? Like, that's your goal when you do that. As long as you're honest with your readers, so people know that it's not real history, it's alt history based on what if something changed. Maybe you want to write an actual history that explores the possibilities of, how did I write this, the what if, while keeping yourself firmly based in historical facts, employing the use of the what if to better understand what actually was. You'll find this in a lot of Civil War history. What if this person had done this differently, or what if this? They discuss it briefly, how it might have been different, but they're always keeping it firmly based in what actually happened. And they're always using actual evidence to pose the what if. Like, what if Longstreet had won the argument with Lee about charging around the Union left at Gettysburg? Because there's actual evidence of that discussion. In these instances, the best course you can take when preparing your narrative and your characters really can be summed up in one word I gave you earlier: research. The only way you can truly craft a narrative that honors the history you are trying to tell is by immersing yourself in that world through research. You will study methods for researching, you will practice researching in a lot of your other classes, and we will delve into research in brief throughout the rest of this course as it connects to the Dramatica process, but I cannot foot stomp this word enough. You cannot do this unless you are thoroughly engrossed in the subject material. You need to do a lot of research, especially if you are writing narrative history or even historical fiction that you want people to take seriously. It's like in science fiction or fantasy. You can pretend that people have the ability to move things with their minds, but that doesn't change physics. When they move things with their minds, that thing still has weight. They have to actually be able to move that. If you have a flying car, sure, you can fly, but it doesn't change the fact that it still takes you 20 hours to get to the other side of the planet. Physics still exists. As long as you are consistent with that change, the readers, the viewers will go along with it. As soon as you become inconsistent, they check out. It's the same with historical figures. If you're writing historical fiction, there is a little bit more leeway, but the more real the character is, the more familiar it is to them, then when you have them say something that you're creating that is still in tune with their character, it still honors who they are, your readers are going to be like, yeah, yes, they could have said it like that. Narrative history does the same thing. Sometimes they want to have the conversation there, and the historian then spends the time writing out a conversation that sounds like it took place back in, say, the 19th century, using the lingo common to that time, but also keeping in mind the person's motivations, their beliefs, their worldview, stuff like that. That's it for today. We dove into character creation in brief. We're going to go into more of that next. In particular, we talked about the importance of doing your homework, basing yourself in research so you can resist inserting your present viewpoints into the past and being too revisionist. Alt history, the whole concept of alternate history is you're revising something. As long as you only change limited things and then everything else is consistent, it's a much better read. There are some contexts where you will be revisionist. That's okay. We'll discuss more of those as we continue through the process. Until next time.